All right. Okay, thank you. Take it away, George.
All right, good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us. And I just want to, as a caveat, mention that they're doing construction downstairs. So if you hear any sort of construction noise, it's not an ongoing thing. It's not constant, but something may come up. I just wanted to make everybody aware of that before we got started. So let me share my screen and we'll go ahead and get started. All right. So as Karen mentioned, and as all of you know from the invite, we're here to talk about 1099 setup in QuickBooks Online and QuickBooks Desktop. On the screen right now, I have my contact information listed. If any of you want to jot that down, in the event that we don't get through all the questions at the end of the session, you'll have that you could follow up either with Karen or with myself. I'll be showing that information again at the end of the presentation. If you don't get a chance to jot it down now, you'll have an opportunity then. So just to cover our agenda for the discussion this morning, we're going to cover the following items. We're going to talk about accuracy in 1099 reporting and why it's important, some common compliance errors, information that is needed in order to successfully report on Form 1099s accurately. We'll touch on the common 1099 form types. And then, of course, we're going to walk through the demos in both QuickBooks Desktop and QuickBooks Online and end with a question and answer period. So, but I do want to take a few minutes before we jump right into the software, just to step through the first few bullet points here. I think it helps to set the stage for why we would even care about walking through the software demo. So 1099 accuracy. Why is that important? So the IRS actually has a compliance task force that is specifically geared toward and focused on making sure that payments that are made to non-employees are identified and are being reported so that they can collect the tax revenue on all of those dollars. And so there's a group at the IRS that is focused on this specifically in looking into irregularities or omissions and things of that nature. And so as a business owner, a small business owner, you want to make sure that you're doing everything you can to accurately report those payments. You actually have on your tax return, whether you're filing as a disregarded entity or whether you file as an S Corp or a partnership or a C Corp, there's actually a question on your tax return that asks if you have complied with all of the 1099 requirements that you have for the year. And so when you're signing off on that tax return that everything is accurate and correct, one of the things you're signing off on is the accuracy of whether you did in fact comply with the 1099 reporting requirements. So another reason for you to make sure that you're doing so accurately. The other reason is there are pretty stiff penalties for noncompliance. Those can range anywhere from $50 to $270 for each 1099 that is filed late. The size of the penalty depends on how late it is. But in addition to those penalties, if a company was to ignore the 1099 filing requirement altogether, there are additional penalties for just not filing at all. So it's important to make sure that you're tracking the information and accurately reporting that information. Common compliance errors. One of the biggest errors that we come across in working with clients is the comment that I only have to issue 1099s for contract labor. And while it's true you do have to issue 1099s for contract labor services, It's not the only thing you have to issue a 1099 for. There are other payments such as rents, interest payments, if you've got loans that you're paying back with interest. All of those also require 1099 reporting. The other misconception related to contract labor is, I've heard clients say, well, I only have to report contract labor payments I make for contract labor if it's in the line of work that my business provides, and that is not true. If you own a building and you're making repairs to the building, you're supposed to issue a 1099 to the contractor you're making payments to for the repairs of your building. So it's in a lot of cases broader than what individuals think. Another common thing that we see is, and some of you may have even received notices from the IRS on this, but sometimes there's a mismatch between the name that the 1099 is filed in or under and the type of tax ID number. So what I mean by that is, if you're paying a company for services that require a 1099, then the tax ID number that should be listed on that 1099 should be the recipient's tax ID number, their TIN number as a business. So that's going to be formatted differently than a Social Security number. On the opposite side of that, if you're paying an individual for those services, then the individual's name appears on the 1099, then the tax ID number should be a Social Security number and formatted as a Social Security number on the 1099. You can't mix and match an entity with a Social Security number or an individual with a tax ID number for a business. The next item here is misclassification of employees as 1099 recipients. So we could do a whole separate webinar training on the classification of employees as employees versus contractors. It's beyond the scope of what we're discussing this morning, but just be aware that that there are certain guidelines and regulations that dictate whether or not an individual is an employee and should be receiving a W-2 from you and be on your payroll versus being paid as a contractor and receiving a 1099. So you want to make sure that you familiarize yourself with those guidelines and are in compliance with those. Another thing that we see is that there's an unfamiliarity sometimes with what the filing deadlines are for the 1099s. So for 2021 and for the past several years, since the IRS moved up the deadline, the filing deadline for 1099 NECs is the end of January. So you have till January 31st to make that filing with the IRS, whether you're doing that electronically or if you're mailing, if you're using snail mail, it has to be postmarked by then. And then the final item here is issues with the setup of the accounting software. So nowadays, most accounting software is capable of tracking all of the information you need to quickly pull together your 1099s at the end of the year if you've set the software up correctly. So that's what we're going to be talking about here in a little bit. So let's talk about what information you need to keep track of in order to accurately report on your 1099s. You need your company's name and tax ID number, which I would assume all of you have. But you also need from the vendor. You need the vendor's name, address, and their tax ID number, as we discussed a few minutes ago. And you also need to know the amount that you paid the vendor during the year. So that's important, and most softwares will track what you've paid to the vendor. But it's just important to point out that it's what you've paid to the vendor during the year, not what the vendor may have billed you for during the year. So if you've got open accounts payable at the end of the year to a vendor that requires a 1099, if you haven't paid anything that you haven't paid that's still sitting in accounts payable, those dollars would not appear on the 1099 for that year. They would only appear after you had made those payments. So let's talk about bullet point 2 here and where you get the information in the second bullet point. You want to obtain from any vendors that you do business with a Form W-9, which you can get off of the IRS's website, in which I'm going to pull one up here. This is the form. I've got it zoomed in a little bit. I'm sure most of you are familiar with it, but I just wanted to touch on it. But this is where your vendor is going to put their name. They're going to check off which type of entity they are for tax reporting purposes. And that's important because if they are an S Corp or a C Corp, in most cases, you will not have to issue them a 1099 as the regulations are in place today. There's an exemption for C Corps and S Corps from the 1099 reporting requirement. So that doesn't mean if you're a C Corp or an S Corp, it means if your vendor files their taxes as a C Corp or an S Corp, you may not have to issue them a 1099. The exception to that is if the vendor in question is an attorney. So this is referred to as the corporate exemption for having to file 1099s. It does not apply to attorneys. So if you have an attorney that is a C Corp or an S Corp, you still have to issue a 1099 for them. But they're going to check off how they file their taxes. And then down here is where they're going to put their taxpayer identification number. And again, if they've listed their name and you're making payments to an individual, then they should have their Social Security number down here. Even if they have a business name here, if your checks are being written to an individual, then that's who you issue the 1099 to, and that would require a Social Security number. Versus if there's a business name in box 1, then you're going to get an employer identification number down here. Okay, the most common types of 1099 for small businesses. So there's the 1099 NEC, which is for non-employee compensation, and this used to be on the Form 1099 miscellaneous, but in 2020 the IRS broke that out to its own form rather than being a box on the 1099 miscellaneous. So I'm sure all of you are familiar with that from last year. That is going to be the most common type of 1099 that most small businesses are having to file. The 1099 miscellaneous is still a form. There's still many types of payments that have to be recorded there. The most common of which probably is rent. And rent includes not only rent that you're paying for office space or for a storage space, but it also is related to if you're renting equipment, if that's something that happens in your line of business. It's any sort of rent that's being paid. And then, of course, you also have 1099 INT for those interest payments that I was talking about earlier. Now, QuickBooks and QuickBooks Online can track information for a 1099 NEC, and it can track 1099 miscellaneous information. It cannot track 1099 INT payments. So that is something you still would have to file yourself, either through a different third-party software that does that, or you'd have to manually do the 1099s for those. But you're going to have to track that manually. So here we're going to go ahead and demonstrate. We're going to step into the software, and we're going to demonstrate in QuickBooks Desktop and online how to capture and accurately report the information for 1099 NEC and miscellaneous.
So while George is getting desktop up and running, just a reminder for everyone to ask a question. We're using the conversation icon at the top. There's a little conversation bubble like from a cartoon next to the participants icon. Simply click on that and type in your question. And at the end, I'll be reading all those out for George. If we have a question about your question, then we can unmute you and you can be a little more interactive. But again, throughout this session, feel free to enter in your questions using the show conversation icon up at the top. And when George moves from QuickBooks Desktop to QuickBooks Online, I'll again pop in case anybody had zoned out. You might be waiting for QBO and you might doze during the desktop version. So I'll show my lovely face and wake everybody up and remind you about asking the questions. So thanks.
Okay. Just going to keep this QuickBooks Online session active so it doesn't time me out. All right, here we go. All right, so QuickBooks Desktop. So they're common to both desktop and QuickBooks Online as it relates to the 1099 setup. Is there's a component that relates to the vendor setup, and there's a component that relates to mapping the chart of accounts to the appropriate forms and boxes on the forms. So you're going to see that in both softwares, but we're going to go ahead and start with QuickBooks Desktop. And so let's say that you've got a vendor, and if it's a new vendor, you'll want to get the W-9. If it's an existing vendor that you don't have a W-9 for, now would be the time to reach out to the vendor to go ahead and get one. But let's say you have the W-9, and whether you're setting up the vendor or you're going back to an existing vendor, once you have the 1099 and you've reviewed the information on it and you determine, yes, this vendor does need to receive a 1099. In the vendor setup, you're going to need to make sure you've filled out certain information. The vendor name up here obviously has to be filled out, but you also need to have an address listed in the Build From box. This is the field that QuickBooks will pull from for the address on the 1099. So that information needs to be filled out. On this tax settings tab, this is where you need to put the tax ID number. And you do have to actually put the dashes in. So you have to format it if it's an individual as a social security number or a business as a business tax ID number. The second part of this is if they do require a 1099, you want to make sure this box here is checked. This is what flags the system, the software, to say that payments to this vendor need to be evaluated for 1099 reporting purposes. Okay. So you could do that to any of these, you know, and if you get a W-9 in and the vendor, let's say, is an S Corp or a C Corp, and they are not an attorney, then what you're going to do on that vendor is you can still put the information in. You probably still need the address in order to accurately make payments. You could still put, and I would encourage you to still put the tax ID number in there. Just don't check the box, and that will let the system know that you're not tracking 1099 information for that client, or I'm sorry, for that vendor. So let's say you've got all your vendors updated correctly, you've finished making your payments for the year, and you're now ready to file your 1099s. So the second part of the setup that I mentioned earlier, where you map the chart of accounts to the boxes and the forms, is actually is done through the 1099 processing. So if you go to vendors, you should have a 1099 forms menu option, and you're going to select print e-file 1099 forms. You're going to get a message here. And what this message is basically telling you is you can only map a category from your chart of accounts to one form or the other. You cannot map the same GL account or category to the form 1099 miscellaneous and the 1099 NEC. So if for some reason you were tracking payments that some of them would belong on the NEC form and some of them would belong on the 1099 miscellaneous, if you're tracking those in your chart of accounts to one account, you're going to need to create a second account on your chart of accounts and break those out so that you can associate one account to each form. Yeah, I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. Oh, I meant to mention when we started too, on your Microsoft Teams window, if you maximize the window, it will assist you in being able to see on a run through of this. We got some feedback that it was kind of hard to see some of this. But if you maximize your window and I resize some of this, hopefully you'll be able to see it. So the next step in this process, once you click past that warning message, is you'll see this window, and it's split between Form 1099 NEC and Form 1099 Miscellaneous. So in QuickBooks Desktop, there's kind of a two-pronged approach to issuing these forms. So we're going to go through the 1099 NEC process first, then we'll come back and go through the Form 1099 Miscellaneous. And they're very similar. So when we go through the Form 1099 Miscellaneous, it'll be a quicker walkthrough. But I did want to step through both since it does require kind of a two-pronged approach. So the first screen, when you click to start creating your 1099 NECs, you're going to get a list of vendors, and it says select your 1099 vendors. So these are going to be the vendors that you've checked the box for in the vendor setup. So that's what's going to cause the vendor to populate there. So you can see there are 4 vendors here, and I still have my vendor list behind this here. And you see that the last one, Temp Services LLC, is not here, and that's because we did not have the box checked on that vendor. So that's one thing to notice on this screen. The other thing to notice is we've got a vendor here named Landlord LLC that the system is telling you the account that's used with this vendor is rent expense. Well, rent expense doesn't go on the 1099 NEC. So I'm pointing that out because this is going to be a preference thing. You can either uncheck landlord here, or you can leave it checked. The system is going to know through the rest of the mapping that we do in here not to create a 1099 NEC for this rent expense because that belongs on a 1099 miscellaneous. So I just wanted to point that out to you in case you see it and you say, well, why is the rent expense there? That doesn't go on an NEC. You are correct, but we can leave it there and the software will differentiate if we get the rest of the setup right. So when we click continue, the next page is for you to verify your 1099 information. So there are a lot of fields here. The 3 that are populated are the 3 essential ones in order to file the 1099. So you got to have a vendor name. You have to have a tax ID number. And even though the address field doesn't display an address, if you hover over the name, and I know that's probably very small and hard to see, but if you hover over the name, it does show you whether there's an address there or not. And if there wasn't an address, or let's say if you were missing a tax ID number, this is where you would have a heads up that I need to go in and I need to go edit my vendor in order to fix that. Now, I'm going to mention this field here, state and payer's state number. I'm going to mention this here because for the first time in 2021, the state of Louisiana, which is where we're based out of, and I would imagine many of you are, is going to require filers of 1099s to file 1099s with the state. QuickBooks and QuickBooks Online do not offer a filing service for the state 1099s. So what that means is you're going to have to do that process yourself. So it'll be the same information in when you buy your kit for the year end, if you're doing this on paper, and for the state, either you'll have to use a third-party software that does facilitate the filing of state 1099s electronically outside of QuickBooks, or you're going to have to get paper copies and print them and send them to the state yourself. But the 1099 kits that you buy, you know, I know historically office supply stores have them. They have a copy of the 1099 for the state tax department. It's just up until this point, you didn't need to use it if you were in Louisiana, but you will need to use it this year. So I just wanted to take that opportunity to mention that. So we have everything here that we need to do the filing, so I'm going to click continue. All right, here's the screen where we map the chart of accounts. I was trying to resize that, but it doesn't look like it's going to resize. There we go. The drop-down window up here, you have a couple of options. You can show the 1099 accounts, or you can show all accounts. So if you haven't done this in your software before, you're probably going to want to start with show all accounts. And that's going to give you the listing of all of your accounts. And then you would go through, depending on what the account is, and you would indicate which box on the NEC, because that's the 1099 form we're working on, which box that payments coded to that expense account, which box those should be reported on the 1099 NEC. And for the majority of everything you're going to do, it's going to be box 1. If you have a special circumstance that requires one of these other boxes, that's going to be something you've researched and you know that you need to use it, but the majority of the payments are going to go to box 1. So you notice I've got mapped here repairs and maintenance. So anything that I've coded there to a vendor that requires a 1099 is going to flow through to box 1. I've got contracted services there as well. You know, professional fees is probably another one that should be mapped. So we would come down there, we would map that one. Anything where you're tracking expenses that don't pertain to a 1099, you just leave it as omit, and the system will ignore those. Once you have everything mapped, you can change the drop-down box back to show 1099 accounts, and it's only going to show you the ones that you have mapped. So these, it's important to note, these are the only transactions that are coded here to one of these accounts that apply to NEC, that are paid to a vendor who has the check mark in the vendor setup marked. Those are the only payments and vendors that are going to receive a 1099 NEC. So when we click continue, we get a screen where we can run a couple of reports where we can view the payments that will be included on the 1099s that would be generated at this point, and we can view any payments that would be excluded. This file is not going to have anything excluded because I created this file specifically to demonstrate the training, and all the payments are going to that are entered in here are going to show up on this report here for the included. But it's showing right now, so we've got 4 vendors, and these payments are going to the accounts that are mapped to the Form 1099 NEC or miscellaneous. It's showing me both, because it's showing me rent expense down here. And it's showing the amounts to me regardless of whether the threshold is met, because I'm not sure if you can see this, but Susan Black only received a payment of $500. So she's below the $600 threshold. But the reason it still shows up on this report is because she is a vendor who should receive a 1099, assuming she had enough payments throughout the year. And those payments are being coded to an account that is mapped to the form. So that's why she's showing up here. We're going to notice in a minute, she's not actually going to get a 1099. So if we click continue, the next screen, this actually shows us what 1099s would be generated right now in the system by vendor. So again, we've got all 4 vendors, but the only 2 that have dollar amounts listed are Bob White and Joe's Plumbing. Landlord LLC has a 0 because the payments going there are mapped to rent expense, which is mapped to the Form 1099 miscellaneous, not the Form 1099 NEC. Susan Black was below the threshold of $600, and so there's a 0 here. Now, even though the zeros show up on this screen, that does not mean that a $0 1099 is going to be generated. It means that there's nothing to generate, and the system will ignore those when it goes to generate the 1099s. So on the next screen, here is where you can either print your Form 1099 NECs if you're going to manually complete the filing requirement, or if you're going to use QuickBooks to e-file and use their e-file service, you would click here, and it's going to bring you to the screen where it shows you all of the fees that they charge for that. And if you want to proceed, then it steps you through going ahead and doing that. That's beyond the scope of what we're doing here. But I do want to show you a little bit if you were printing the form. Okay, yeah, it may or may not work for me. Okay, well, this is not, doesn't look like it's going to allow me to do that step. In the last week, QuickBooks has updated their software, and I think this is an unintended consequence of the update. Bear with me a second, and I can make a quick change to make this work. I apologize. I had tested this, and it made me update the file yesterday when I opened it, and apparently it's causing you can no longer print 2020 forms. They've updated in preparation for the end of the year. So I'm just going to make a couple of changes here, and it should put us back on track. No, that didn't do it either. So it's not allowing me to generate. I apologize. It's not allowing me to generate. What I was going to show you there was, I was just going to show you the print, because there's an option if you wind up having an issue with how the printout aligns with the pre-printed forms that you're going to have to buy. There's an adjustment. When you go to the print preview, there's a place there's a button that you can select for print alignment, and it will allow you to adjust the print alignment, and then you can go back through and reprint on plain paper and confirm that it's lining up with the form. So again, my apologies that I'm not able to show you that. But we'll just keep moving in the interest of time on that. So now if we go back through the same process we just did, but if we've got 1099 miscellaneous forms we need to file, we need to go back through that process. And when we get to the screen that shows the NEC and the miscellaneous, we would select Get Started under the miscellaneous screen. And again, we're going to see the vendors, all of the vendors again, they're all going to be checked, but the system is going to know that only the ones that are mapped to this form should be created. Again, you'll get the same screen verifying the 1099 vendor information. You'll get the same screen where you've got to map the accounts. One thing I want to point out to you is the only one I can change here is the one that's already assigned to the miscellaneous form. And again, because this is rent, I have to select which box rent is reported on in the 1099 miscellaneous, on the 1099 miscellaneous form. So that's box 1. But you see some of the other types of payments on that still get reported on 1099 miscellaneous. So if these apply, you would use these. Now, just note this gross proceeds to an attorney. I want to differentiate here. If you're paying an attorney for fees that you are paying for legal services for your company, that goes on 1099 NEC. That does not go in this box 10 on the miscellaneous form. This is for payments that you might be making to an attorney on behalf of their client in the way of a settlement. So those get reported here because they're just going to be a pass-through for the attorney. You still have to report them. You still have to report that you paid them to the attorney, but that's the difference between what's going on this form 1099 miscellaneous box 10 versus payments you're making for legal services for an attorney to represent you or for them to draft some legal documents. That goes on 1099 NEC. But you'll notice here the accounts I mapped previously to the form NEC, I can't drop down and change that box here, and that's because I'm in the part of the program that deals with form 1099 miscellaneous, so it's not going to let me change these. So again, if we continue, we've got the same report here. It's going to show all of them, but it's only going to report the 1099 miscellaneous for Landlord LLC. And you can see that here because this is the screen that shows us what's actually going to be reported. The only vendor that has any dollars indicated is Landlord LLC. And because we mapped rent expense to box 1, the dollar amount showing up there. And so that's the only 1099 miscellaneous that would be created. Yeah, and we have the same issue there that we had with the other one. So, so that's the setup in QuickBooks Desktop. And what I'll tell you, and I'll show you as well, if you've got the setup done correctly, there's a report here under Vendors 1099 Forms. There's a summary report, but there's also a detail report, which I find more helpful. When you run that report for the date range in question, if you've got the setup correctly, the vendors will show up here with the transactions that are coded to the accounts that you've set up. And it'll give you a report that will show you which vendors you've marked eligible for 1099s and what dollar amounts you've paid them during the year. And you can toggle these drop-down boxes up here to where you'll see all vendors or just those that you've checked the box in the vendor setup. And you can also select accounts to show only those accounts that you've mapped to the form 1099 or all accounts. So you can play with those to see, I mean, if you pull this report and you know you've paid more to a vendor than what's showing here, maybe you want to come here and say, okay, show me all allowed accounts because maybe something got misposted to an account that is not mapped. And you either need to correct the posting on that transaction or maybe there's another account you need to map to the form. And so you could do that as a way of continuing to clean the data before you start the filing process. All right, so that completes the 1099 QuickBooks Desktop.
And while George is getting ready to show QuickBooks Online, just a reminder for everyone that joined recently, if you would like to ask a question throughout the session, there is a conversation icon at the top. It's like a talking bubble from a cartoon. Simply click on that, type in your question, and at the end, when George is done with the QuickBooks Online demo, I will be reading the questions out to him, and that way everyone can hear the questions and the answers. So again, the show conversation, that's where you can type in your question. Thanks, everyone.
All right, so switching over to QuickBooks Online, as I mentioned earlier, it's essentially the same concept on the setup. You have to tell the system that the vendor is eligible for a 1099, and we'll step through that. And then you also have to map the accounts, which again is done through the 1099 processing part of the program. So the first step is if we go to the vendor screen, and I'm just going to go ahead and pull up one of the vendors and edit them. You've got, again, from your W-9, you're going to put the vendor's name. You're going to put the address in, and there's a section here for you to put the tax ID number or social security number, depending on which is applicable. And here's the box where you have to check to say you want to track 1099 payments for this individual or for this entity. So that's where you set it up on the vendor. So that's the address, tax ID, and check the box. So that's just like it was in desktop for the most part. Now, the processing of the 1099s themselves is a little bit different in online. So from the vendor window, you've got this button that says Prepare 1099s. And there are other options here, and if you've used one of these other options most recently, it could be when you come to the vendor screen, you're going to see one of these options up here in this button. So if that's the case, just drop this menu down and you'll see Prepare 1099s down here and you can select it. But since it's already the one that's on the button, I'm just going to select it. And you're going to get this screen to start going through and setting up and filing your 1099s. And I'm going to back up just a little bit because I was working in here earlier. But the first screen that's going to come up for you is your company's info. So you have to have your name and address. It's going to require you to have a phone number if you don't already have it in the system, and it's going to require you to have your company's tax ID number. If you need to edit any of that information, you click the pencil icon and you can edit it. If any of it's missing, it's not going to let you go beyond this screen until you've entered the appropriate information. Okay, so this screen, this is where it's a little different than QuickBooks Desktop. So in QuickBooks Desktop, we had kind of two parallel processes you had to step through for the NEC and the 1099 miscellaneous. Here it's all done on this screen. So here you're going to check this box if you make payments to non-employees for services. And you can see over here, it already has indicated that, okay, this relates to box 1 on the 1099 NEC. Then down here is where you're going to map the accounts, and it's going to automatically associate whatever you select in this field with box 1 of the 1099 NEC. So I already have some accounts selected, and you can just, in order to choose your accounts, you can just start typing and it will auto sort and search, and then you can check the box here to say, yes, I want to include anything I've coded to contract services, on Form 1099 NEC in box 1, and it'll add that over here. So right now you can see I have contract services and repairs and maintenance, but let's say if I also wanted to have professional fees. So I could type that, check it, and it adds it in here. So these are the accounts that are mapped to box 1 on Form 1099 NEC. If I pay rent, and again, this is for real estate or for equipment, I would check the rent box. And right now I only have the one account mapped. So I just went in and selected that one account. And so it just shows that account name here. But if you had another account where you were also tracking rents of a different nature, just like we did up here, you can go select that account as well, and it will show off to the side all the accounts you have mapped. And in this case, rent gets mapped to box 1 on Form 1099 miscellaneous. And then you do have other boxes down here that relate to both Form 1099 NEC and miscellaneous. So if any of those apply to your business, you would select, and then it's going to give you the opportunity to map the appropriate account from your chart of accounts to that box. So once you have all your mapping done, the next screen shows you your list of 1099 vendors. And you'll notice here we've got a couple of things in red where it's saying there's a problem. So I left this way so I could show you. You can edit anything that's an issue from this screen by clicking edit. And in this case, it's wanting a business name here because all we have is a display name. So I'm just going to copy that name up here and paste it. And it doesn't like my fictitious tax ID number, so I have to play with that. But you won't get that issue when you've got a true tax ID number there. And then on Sue Black, it's the same thing. There's a display name, but because this is an individual, they want a first and last name. So now those conditions have been remedied and we can continue. But this is where you would check for any missing information that you needed in order to successfully file the 1099. All right, the next screen is going to show you which 1099 NECs would be filed based on current information. So here we are. It's the same data as what was in the desktop file, so we're winding up with the same two. Bob White's going to get one for $700, an NEC, and Joe's Plumbing is going to get a 1099 NEC for $2,500. But it shows you the 1099 miscellaneous on the same screen. So Landlord LLC is going to get a 1099 for $1,000 of rents. Now this one I should be able to show you. Once you click finish, that you're finished and you want to prepare the forms, you get the option to either, once January 1st comes along, if you want to e-file, this button would be active. You could select it and step through that process, or you can select to print and mail them yourself. And if you do so, here's where you can print a sample of each form, 1099 NEC, 1099 miscellaneous, and the summary form 1096 that you'll need for each of these. Two different form types, you're going to need a 1096 with each. So you could print a sample on paper, and it's going to show you, here's what the sample would look like. Now this is not data from our file, this is just a sample. But you could print this, and then you could line it up with your paper form to make sure it lines up. And if it does, you're going to say, yes, it looks good. You're going to put your forms in, you're going to print them. If it doesn't, you click no, it doesn't line up. And here's where you can play with the alignment and make any adjustments you need to and reprint and see if it then lines up with the form until you get it right. So once you've got it lined up, you would select one at a time. Okay, I want to print my 1099 NECs. And here's, it's going to display it for you. So there's the one for Bob White. There's the one for Joe's Plumbing, which were the two we had there. Then you'd have a 1096 that summarizes all of your 1099 NECs. Again, you can view that. And so this is just for your company as a summary. You had two 1099s for a total of $3,200. And then the same is true for the 1099 miscellaneous form. If we preview that one, you've got your one 1099 to Landlord LLC for $1,000. And of course, the 1096 is just going to have the information from that one, since we only had one 1099 miscellaneous. So again, it's a similar concept, obviously, to the desktop file. It's just a little different in terms of how you map the accounts, really. It's done in one screen on QuickBooks Online compared to the two separate processes and the two separate screens that you step through in desktop. So with that, I will turn things back over to Karen to see what questions may have come in.
Yes, and we have several.
Okay.
The first one is check written to an individual instead of a company on the invoice. Is it okay to issue the 1099 to the company or no, if the check was written to the individual?
So what you would need to do in that case is speak to your vendor and find out, do they file as the business when they file their taxes, or do they file as their individual name? And you want to make sure that they fill out the W-9 according to how they file their taxes. So if I go back to the W-9, the name in box 1, it says, as shown on your income tax return. So they should be filling this out as they file their taxes for this. If they file it as an individual, that's what should be here with a social security number, and that's who you should be paying. If they file as a business name with a business tax ID number, that's what should be on here, and that's who you should be paying.
Okay, the second question, thank you. Some of our vendors have one address to send payments and another to send tax forms. Is there an easy way to handle that?
Unfortunately, no, because QuickBooks pulls the information from this field, and this is the field this is the field that prints on checks, and it's also the field that QuickBooks pulls for the 1099s. So the only way to do that, because you only get an option for one address there. It's not like the ship to address where you can set up multiple. I would tell you, before you do your 1099s, you're going to have to change the address, do your 1099s if they want their tax forms sent one place, and then change it back before you make your next payment to that vendor.
Okay, the next question, and again, for anyone that wants to ask a question, there is a conversation icon up at the top. Feel free to type it in. The next question we have is, how do you get state number for 1099? Is there a form?
The state number for the 1099 is going to be your number with the LDR. So if you're filing, and this again, this is very new, newly released requirement even. So what I would tell you to do is to check with the LDR as well if you have any questions specifically. But my understanding is if you are an entity that has to file a state tax return, then you would use your LDR number for that. If you are not the type of entity that has to file a separate entity tax return. Then if you have payroll, you have a number with the LDR for your payroll tax filings. And basically the number is the same except for the 3-digit extension on the end. So it's going to be the same. I forget how many digits it is, maybe 9 or 10 digits with an extension on the end of it. So if you're, again, if your company files a state tax return as an entity, that's the number you want to use. If not, it would be the number you're using to remit your payroll taxes to the LDR, not to the Workforce Commission. So it would be for your Louisiana state income. If you're using the payroll tax number, it would be what you're using to report your withholding tax for the state.
Okay. The next question is, can you explain what applies to medical payments, 1099 miscellaneous?
Yes. So 1099 miscellaneous. Let's go back here. Might be the easiest place to see it. The medical payments there would be if you're paying a doctor for, let's say, if things like drug testing, or if you're paying medical bills, let's say there's an accident and for whatever reason the company is going to pay the medical bills directly out of pocket. Any payments like that you're paying to a doctor would go in that box. And so what you would do, and I'm going to look at it here just to get to it a little quicker, but it would be the same idea in desktop. But you would map those payments. You check this box, and wherever you've coded those payments, and again, you're going to want to make sure that you're not coding a bunch of things to the same account, because you only want the pertinent things going here, but you would have an account on your chart of accounts where you would track those and you would map it here.
Okay. Next question. PayPal, Venmo, Zelle, Cash App, which of these are excluded?
That's a good question. So I know that if you've made a payment with a credit card, those payments are excluded, and the software will exclude those automatically, provided that you've set your accounts up as so if you have to have your credit card set up as credit card account types in QuickBooks, and you have to be processing the transactions that way on an individual transaction basis. And then if you're doing that, when you've recorded a credit card payment, QuickBooks will exclude those. How PayPal and Venmo and payment services like that fall into that, I would have to check on that. I don't know off the top of my head whether or not those are treated the same as credit card payments. And again, the reason credit card payments are excluded is that the credit card companies are required to file 1099-K to the entities receiving the credit card payments. I'm not sure off the top of my head how PayPal and Venmo are treated. So I'll make a note of that and see if I can get an answer. And then Karen, maybe we can send that out to the list that the invite for the meeting or for the webinar went out to.
Absolutely. We have 3 other questions. The next one is, what is direct sales?
I have not come across that personally, so I hesitate to give you a hard and fast answer on that. What it sounds like to me is if you've got someone that you've hired as a contractor, they're contacting or reaching out to your clients or potential clients and selling on your behalf, and you're compensating them for those sales. If that's a specific function that they are providing to your business, kind of as a sales rep for hire. But again, I'm not 100% certain on that. Where I would direct you is to the instructions for Form 1099. There may be a better definition there.
Okay. And two more questions. One goes back to the individual versus company question, the first question that was asked, and this is a follow-up. What if the individual is not cooperating with filling out a W-9 to avoid paying taxes? They refuse to fill out the form as an individual, but insist the check is written to them personally.
Yeah, that's always a fun one. What I would tell you with that is I always encourage, and I know it's not always practical, but I always encourage clients, get a W-9 from the vendor before you make the first payment to them. That gives them a little bit of an incentive to be as cooperative as possible. You know, at the end of the day, I guess you just have to consider if you've got a vendor you have an ongoing relationship with that does not want to provide you with a form that you need to stay in compliance with tax reporting, you may want to reconsider that relationship. Again, I don't know the specifics of that relationship, but if you've got an alternative to use for whatever you're sourcing from that vendor, you know, that may be something to consider, because you don't want to be on the hook for something that you were trying to comply with, but you couldn't. Now, an alternative way to handle it would be for you to document. You know, so if you're making requests via email and they refuse via email, you can document it for your file. In the case that you ever got audited and the question came up, you could at least provide the auditor with, hey, here's where I attempted to get the information and repeatedly was not able to, but I don't know what would happen in that situation. I mean, ultimately, the requirement to do the filing is still on the business owner, unfortunately.
All right. Okay. The last question we have this morning, George, what is the best way to report money received and money paid out for hurricane relief?
That's not really necessarily 1099 related. I guess it could be if you're paying contractors for the repairs. And it goes a little bit beyond the scope of my understanding. I can tell you in general, I think there are some rules surrounding if you've got, you know, if you receive the money this year, but you're not going to spend it all this year. I believe there are some rules that allow you to defer any sort of a gain or income on that in 2021, and you have time allowed to finish your repairs before you would have to recognize any excess that you received from the insurance company. So what I would suggest you do there is follow up with whoever's assisting you with your taxes in order to get all the technical aspects of that answered. But I do think that I don't think you get penalized for the fact that, hey, there was an August storm, almost September storm. I got my money in November and I can't find a contractor to complete my repairs until next year. I don't think you have to report that as taxable income for the current year. But it's beyond my area of expertise in terms of exactly how that needs to be tracked.
Okay. And one last question came in, George. Is there a way to verify that the W-9 is correct? We have had issues where the vendor completed the W-9, but the IRS said it was a mismatch.
So when that happens, all you're required to do is keep a copy of the W-9 sent to you. If it's an obvious mismatch, like we talked about today, it's an individual and they give you a company tax ID number or vice versa, you should resolve that with the vendor. But if you're relying on that information and you have that in your file, you are covered. You're working with the information that was provided. What I would tell you is when you get the notice from the IRS, don't ignore it. Follow the instructions on the notice to do whatever is pertinent at that point once they've notified you that there's something that needs to be fixed.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. I really appreciate everybody's time. We are recording this session,